Who decides when loyalty becomes a liability? Blood on the asphalt is never accidental in outlaw biker politics. One killing exposed how authority fractures under pressure, how silence replaces justice, and how discipline survives without explanation. This incident did not end with a body on the street. It reshaped behavior, tightened control, and hardened mistrust across charters. Years later, the consequences still operate quietly inside the Hells Angels motorcycle club, unresolved, unseen, and deliberately untouched by those who understand power.
Mother's Day and I take him to the cemetery.
Cindy Harbor wants answers. She wants to know who killed her 24-year-old son Josh 17 years ago.
I want to know why. I want to know.
Authority without presence. The killing did not begin on the asphalt, it began inside a power vacuum. When senior leadership was removed from the street through federal detention, authority did not disappear, it fragmented. Ventura's charter operated without direct command, while still bound to the same expectations of obedience, enforcement, and image. Decisions that normally passed through experienced hands instead moved through intermediaries, favors, and inherited trust. In outlaw structures, absence at the top does not soften control, it hardens it. Within the Hells Angels motorcycle club, hierarchy functions through visibility and reputation. Rank is enforced through presence. When that presence is removed, enforcement shifts sideways. Senior members rely on lieutenants. Lieutenants rely on reputation. Reputation becomes currency. Younger members elevated during these periods carry more symbolic weight than protection. Their patch signals continuity, while leadership is unreachable. That symbolism makes them visible. Visibility creates risk. Rapid advancement during leadership isolation changes how a member is perceived internally. It raises questions about sponsorship, loyalty chains, and future alignment. In clubs built on slow progression, speed is not neutral. It suggests urgency. It also suggests vulnerability. Members promoted during instability often represent the future direction of a charter, whether they intend to or not. That perception alone can make them leverage points in unresolved conflicts. Ventura was not operating in isolation. Charter relationships across California and Arizona were strained by overlapping territory, financial disputes, and unresolved disciplinary issues. Authority disputes rarely surface publicly. They surface through selective enforcement. Who is correct? Who is ignored? Who is protected? When enforcement becomes inconsistent, retaliation becomes personalized. Individuals absorb pressure meant for institutions. The absence of centralized leadership also altered communication. Orders could not be issued directly. Guidance moved through unofficial channels. That method creates ambiguity. Ambiguity allows deniability. In environments where discipline is enforced without paperwork, deniability becomes operational cover. It also ensures that when violence occurs, responsibility dissolves into structure. Members elevated during this period were not shielded by the usual buffer of senior oversight. They carried expectations without insulation. They were expected to represent discipline while lacking the authority to enforce it. That imbalance is dangerous. It places the individual between competing pressures from older members, rival charters, and external scrutiny. Law enforcement pressure amplified this instability. Federal cases removed senior figures and restricted communication, but they did not dismantle networks. Instead, they forced them underground. Surveillance intensified. Informant paranoia increased. Internal trust narrowed. In such environments, any perceived deviation becomes suspect. Loyalty is assumed until it is questioned. Once questioned, the process is irreversible. By the time violence reached the street, the conditions were already set. A visible member, an unstable authority structure, unresolved disputes across charters. External pressure is closing in. No direct leadership to absorb fallout, no clear channel for accountability. The asphalt became the only place where consequences could resolve themselves. Fast-tracked loyalty. Advancement inside outlaw motorcycle clubs is designed to be slow by intention. Time tests obedience. Menial roles test restraint. Long exposure tests silence. When that process accelerates, it is not viewed as efficiency. It is viewed as a distortion. Fast-tracked members disrupt the balance between earned authority and perceived entitlement, even when they follow rules precisely. The problem is not behavior, it is optics. During periods of internal strain, rapid patching serves a strategic purpose. It signals continuity to rivals and reassurance to allies. It tells surrounding charters that leadership still functions even when senior figures are physically absent. But the individual carrying that signal becomes symbolic. Symbols attract pressure. Pressure attracts scrutiny. Scrutiny inside outlaw hierarchies often ends in correction. A newly patched member elevated during instability is immediately categorized. Some see potential leadership, others see an imposed future. In both cases, the member becomes a reference point for unresolved power struggles. Every action is read as alignment. Every association is evaluated for intent. Silence is not neutral. Presence is not accidental. Fast advancement also compresses social insulation. Normally, years of shared risk create layers of protection. Long-time members intervene quietly when tensions rise. That intervention requires history. Without it, a member stands exposed. Disputes that would normally be absorbed by the structure land directly on the individual. That exposure is not a failure of loyalty. It is a consequence of timing. This timing intersected with existing fractures. Financial disputes, prior disciplinary actions, and cross-charter resentment did not vanish with leadership removal. They stagnated. Stagnation inside criminal hierarchies is dangerous. It allows grievances to ferment without resolution. When a new figure rises quickly, those grievances attach themselves to the nearest visible symbol. Law enforcement pressure magnified this effect. Surveillance makes indirect communication necessary. Indirect communication increases misinterpretation. Rumors travel faster than clarification. Allegiances are inferred rather than confirmed. In that environment, a fast-tracked member can be interpreted as an emissary, a proxy, or a future threat, without ever acting as one. There is also an internal expectation placed on accelerated members. They are expected to embody discipline immediately. They are watched for weakness. Any perceived misstep becomes confirmation of suspicion. The margin for error collapses. In clubs where correction is physical and final, a collapsed margin is fatal. Fast-tracked loyalty also alters how violence is justified. When hierarchy is clear, violence is framed as enforcement. When hierarchy is blurred, violence is framed as a necessity. That distinction matters. Enforcement requires authorization. Necessity requires only justification after the fact. This shift allows individuals to act while believing they are protecting the club rather than defying it. By the time tensions reach public space, the individual is already isolated internally, not abandoned, not condemned, simply unprotected. The system does not announce this status. It reveals itself only when something goes wrong and no one intervenes. Fast advancement did not cause the killing. It removed the safeguards that might have prevented it. The geography of exposure.
Man in a black leather coat pulled out a gun and shot him, then took off in a red Honda.
The description was pretty vague.
Location matters in outlaw violence, not because of chance, but because of control. Certain places function as neutral ground only on the surface. Bars near charter borders, event corridors, or shared traffic routes appear public, but operate as informal meeting points where visibility replaces permission. Violence in these spaces sends messages without paperwork. It is seen, it is remembered, it is rarely explained. Cave Creek sat at an intersection of overlapping interests. It was not deep Ventura territory, and it was not fully removed from Arizona charter influence. That ambiguity made it useful. Individuals moved through without triggering an immediate territorial response. Outsiders blended with locals. Surveillance was inconsistent. Law enforcement presence existed but lacked permanence. These conditions create opportunity, not randomness. Standing outside a bar in such a location is not passive behavior, it is exposure. Outside space removes the buffer of interior witnesses while maintaining enough foot traffic to ensure the act is seen. This balance is intentional. Executions inside draw immediate police focus. Executions in isolated areas reduce witnesses. Executions at entrances create visibility with confusion. Confusion protects the shooter. The mechanics of the killing reflected this logic. Close range, no escalation, no confrontation, no warning. The act was not reactive, it was procedural. The shooter approached directly, acted decisively, and departed without urgency. This pattern aligns with enforcement behavior rather than spontaneous conflict. The lack of verbal exchange removed ambiguity. The absence of a chase removed witnesses. Descriptions varied immediately. That variation is not unusual in public shootings. It is useful. Conflicting witness accounts dilute investigative focus. When descriptions diverge, law enforcement must widen the scope. A wider scope slows resolution. In outlaw environments, time favors silence. Every passing hour reduces the chance of cooperation. Every unresolved day increases the fear of consequence. The choice of location also complicates retaliation. Violence on neutral or semi-neutral ground blurs responsibility. No charter can claim clear jurisdiction. Retaliation risks misattribution. Misattribution triggers escalation. Escalation draws law enforcement pressure. Silence becomes the safer option. Geography also affects who is expected to intervene. In the core territory, senior members monitor presence. On the margins, individuals operate without immediate oversight. That absence allows actions to occur without instant internal correction. It also ensures that if violence happens, there is no immediate internal reckoning. The timing further reduced risk. Late evening, high turnover of patrons, alcohol present, memory unreliable, security distracted, lighting inconsistent. These are not incidental conditions. They are selected advantages. Violence executed under these conditions is harder to reconstruct and easier to deny. After the shooting, the location became irrelevant officially. The scene was processed, cleared, and reopened. No marker remained. This erasure matters. It prevents the site from becoming a focal point for memory or accountability. In outlaw systems, memory sustains retaliation. Erasure sustains stability. The geography did not cause the killing. It allowed it to function without consequence. When the location is chosen correctly, the act becomes difficult to own and impossible to reverse. Silence as enforcement. Silence after the killing was not an absence of information, it was an action. In outlaw structures, silence functions as enforcement long after violence ends. It prevents misattribution, blocks retaliation, and limits exposure. Most importantly, it protects the hierarchy from being tested publicly. When no one speaks, authority remains abstract and therefore intact. Immediately after the shooting, the expected fracture never occurred. No internal disputes surfaced in public. No visible panic. No rapid disciplinary corrections. That absence signaled alignment, not confusion. In these environments, disagreement leaks quickly when it exists. Silence indicates consensus or fear strong enough to simulate it. Either outcome stabilizes the system. Law enforcement pressure intensified in the days that followed. Interviews were conducted, contacts were made, known associates were approached. The result was uniform, non-cooperation. This response was not spontaneous. It reflects conditioning. Members are trained over the years to understand that speaking creates cascading consequences. One statement implicates others. One detail invites surveillance. One break invites retaliation. Silence becomes rational, self-preservation. The structure of the club reinforces this behavior. Accountability flows inward, not outward. Internal discipline addresses perceived violations. External systems are treated as adversarial by default. Cooperation with investigators is interpreted as betrayal, regardless of intent. That interpretation is enforced through isolation, status removal, and threat of violence. The cost of silence is abstract. The cost of speaking is immediate. This dynamic also distorts investigations. Detectives rely on pressure points, fear, guilt, and incentive. In outlaw environments, those points are inverted. Fear encourages silence. Guilt is absorbed by collective identity. Incentives are meaningless when protection comes from within the system rather than outside it. Traditional investigative leverage loses effectiveness. Silence also functions temporally. It does not need to be permanent. It only needs to last long enough for momentum to die. Witness memories degrade. Media attention shifts. Resource allocation changes. Cold cases emerge not from lack of evidence alone, but from delayed disruption. Outlaw silence is calibrated to outlast institutional urgency. Internally, silence prevents reassessment. When a killing is not discussed openly, it is not debated. Without debate, there is no correction, no policy change, no clarification of boundaries. This preserves ambiguity. Ambiguity protects those who acted and those who benefited indirectly. It also ensures that lessons are learned quietly, not documented. The absence of retaliation is often misinterpreted as resolution. In reality, it indicates unresolved tension being contained rather than discharged. Contained tension remains volatile. It does not disappear. It relocates. Members internalize it. Charters adjust behavior. Movement patterns change. Trust narrows further. These shifts are invisible externally, but reshape internal operations. Silence also protects reputations selectively. It allows individuals to remain unchallenged publicly, while being avoided privately. Status may remain intact, while influence diminishes quietly. This outcome avoids open conflict while still enforcing consequences. It is slower but safer. As time passed, the silence did not weaken. Rewards increased. Public appeals continued. None altered the internal calculus. The system held, not because the truth was unknown, but because revealing it would destabilize more than it would resolve. The suspect everyone knew. Suspicion inside outlaw structures does not require proof. It requires history. When a name begins circulating internally, it does so because it already carries weight. That weight is built from prior violence, unresolved conflicts, and a reputation for instability. In this case, one individual fit that profile too closely to ignore. His past intersected with too many fault lines for coincidence to be credible. The individual had a documented pattern of volatility, conflicts with multiple charters, financial disputes that escalated beyond mediation, disciplinary problems that were never fully resolved. These issues did not exist in isolation. They accumulated. In outlaw hierarchies, accumulation matters more than any single incident. It creates a narrative that others rely on when interpreting events. This reputation was not theoretical. It was reinforced by prior acts of violence and disregard for internal protocol. In clubs where discipline is enforced rigidly, repeated violations signal either defiance or incompetence. Both are dangerous. Members who cannot be controlled internally often become external problems. When violence occurs nearby, those individuals become default suspects regardless of direct involvement. There were also personal fractures. Legal disputes involving bail obligations and court appearances created resentment that extended beyond the individual. When obligations are violated, humiliation follows. Humiliation inside outlaw circles is not minor. It damages standing and provokes long-term hostility. Those emotions do not dissipate with time. They wait for an opportunity. The individual's relationship with Ventura was particularly strained. Prior altercations and charter-level disputes created lingering hostility. At one point, disciplinary action escalated to the removal of patches from affiliated members. That act carries symbolic severity. It communicates rejection and dominance simultaneously. It also guarantees lasting resentment. When violence later touches the same network, history reasserts itself. Witness descriptions after the killing were inconsistent, but certain elements aligned with this individual's physical presence and known movement patterns. Consistency was not enough for evidence. It was enough for belief. Belief inside outlaw culture shapes behavior more than certainty. Members adjust interactions, distances, and alliances based on belief, not judicial standards. Law enforcement attention briefly aligned with these suspicions. Interviews were conducted, backgrounds reviewed, nothing materialized. That outcome reinforced internal assumptions rather than dispelling them. Lack of arrest is often interpreted as confirmation of capability rather than innocence. The reasoning is simple. If someone could do it and get away with it, their reputation grows. Importantly, suspicion did not lead to visible retaliation. That absence suggests complexity. Either the individual was protected, acted with implicit approval, or did not act at all. Each possibility carries consequences. Protection implies higher-level alignment. Implicit approval implies internal consensus. Innocence implies a deeper, less visible actor. None of these scenarios resolves tension. They redistribute it. Over time, the name did not disappear. It hardened. Years passed. Encounters occurred. The perception remained unchanged. In outlaw systems, longevity of suspicion matters. Temporary rumors fade. Persistent ones define legacy. This individual's legacy became inseparable from the killing, regardless of legal outcome. When retaliation does not come. In outlaw environments, the absence of retaliation is rarely accidental. Violence is expected to generate a response unless restraint serves a larger purpose. After the killing, observers anticipated escalation. It did not happen. No visible reprisals, no open confrontations, no public correction. That restraint carried meaning. Retaliation requires clarity. Someone must be identified internally as responsible. Authorization must be implied or granted. Conditions must allow action without triggering broader conflict. When any of these elements are missing, violence pauses. That pause does not indicate forgiveness. It indicates uncertainty or strategic suppression. Multiple factors contributed to that suppression. The killing occurred outside core territory, complicating jurisdiction. Responsibility could not be assigned cleanly without risking misdirected retaliation. Misattribution inside outlaw networks is costly. It escalates disputes beyond control and attracts unwanted law enforcement attention. Leaders avoid that outcome when pressure is already high. There was also the issue of timing. Federal cases were active. Surveillance was intense. Informant paranoia was widespread. Any retaliatory act risked exposing internal movement patterns and communication channels. Retaliation under these conditions would not be symbolic. It would be operationally reckless. Internal discipline may have replaced external retaliation. This form of response is quieter. It involves distancing, removal of access, and erosion of influence rather than violence. Such measures satisfy the need for correction without creating additional risk. They are invisible to outsiders but decisive internally. The absence of retaliation also suggests contested authority. Without a clear leadership consensus, action stalls. Individuals with influence may disagree on responsibility or consequence. When disagreement exists, inaction becomes the default. In outlaw systems, acting without consensus risks internal fracture. That risk outweighs the desire for immediate retribution. Law enforcement scrutiny further discouraged visible response. Retaliatory violence following a public killing creates a pattern that investigators exploit. Patterns invite task forces. Task forces disrupt revenue, movement, and recruitment. Containment becomes preferable to expression. This restraint had consequences. It signaled to members that protection was conditional. It reinforced the reality that visibility carries risk without guarantee of response. That message alters behavior. Members reduce exposure. Interactions narrow. Trust contracts. The system becomes more rigid and less forgiving. Over time, the lack of retaliation reshaped internal narratives. The killing was no longer framed as an attack requiring a response. It became a warning embedded in collective memory. Warnings do not require action, they require adjustment. Adjustment preserves stability while acknowledging danger. This shift also affected recruitment and advancement. Rapid promotion slowed. Oversight tightened. Movement between charters became more cautious. The system learned from the event without acknowledging it publicly. Retaliation did not come because retaliation would have answered questions that leaders preferred to leave unresolved. Silence and restraint maintained ambiguity. Ambiguity preserved control. The cost of that choice would surface later, in subtler ways. Law enforcement pressure without leverage. After the killing, law enforcement moved quickly, but speed did not equal control. Detectives understood the environment they were entering. Outlaw motorcycle clubs do not respond to conventional investigative pressure. They anticipate it. They are structured to absorb it. Interviews, surveillance, and public appeals function differently when the subjects are conditioned to treat external authority as hostile by default. Initial investigative efforts focused on proximity and association. Known members were contacted. Locations were canvassed. Prior disputes were reviewed. None of this was novel to the people being questioned. Many had experienced similar scrutiny before. Familiarity reduces fear. When fear diminishes, leverage disappears. Investigators relied heavily on witness cooperation. That cooperation never materialized. Public settings produce witnesses, but outlaw culture neutralizes them. Individuals present understand the consequences of being identified as sources. Even non-members internalize this reality through reputation alone. The absence of statements was not the result of intimidation at the scene, it was the result of long-term conditioning. Rewards were offered and later increased. Financial incentives assume that information has monetary value. In this environment, information carries negative value. Providing it creates a risk that outweighs the reward. Protection offered by authorities is abstract and temporary. Retaliation from within the system is direct and permanent. Rational actors choose silence. Law enforcement also faced structural limitations. Without insider testimony, cases rely on forensic reconstruction and circumstantial evidence. The shooting produced minimal usable forensic data. Close-range execution in a public space leaves little behind that can survive courtroom standards. Ballistics without a recovered weapon narrow possibilities but do not identify actors. Surveillance yielded limited results. Movement patterns shifted immediately after the killing. Individuals altered their routines. Contact networks contracted. Phones went quiet or were replaced. These adaptations are standard practice. They frustrate post-event analysis by erasing baseline behavior. Without baseline data, anomalies lose meaning. Investigators attempted indirect pressure. Associates outside the core circle were approached. Family connections were contacted. These efforts rarely succeed. Outlaw structures deliberately insulate families. Information does not flow outward, and pressure applied externally is interpreted internally as weakness rather than threat. Public appeals served a different purpose. They signaled ongoing attention. They maintained institutional presence. They reassured the public that the case remained active. They did not penetrate the internal barrier. Appeals rely on conscience. Outlaw systems prioritize survival over conscience. The investigation gradually shifted from active pursuit to maintenance. Files remained open. Periodic reviews occurred. New detectives revisited old leads. None altered the fundamental equation. Without cooperation, progress stalled. This outcome was predictable to those inside the system from the beginning. Importantly, the lack of resolution reinforced internal confidence. Each unanswered year validated the effectiveness of silence. That validation strengthens future non-cooperation. It teaches members that the system works if everyone adheres to it. Success becomes precedent. Law enforcement pressure did not collapse the structure, it hardened it. Members learned which behaviors drew attention and which avoided it. Operational discipline improved, exposure decreased. The killing became a lesson rather than a liability. The case remained open. The answers remained internal, and the distance between investigation and resolution widened with every passing year. Internal fracture without collapse. The killing did not fracture the organization openly, it fractured internally. Outlaw motorcycle clubs are designed to survive shocks without visible failure. They do this by isolating damage rather than confronting it. After the incident, there was no public reckoning, but internal alignment shifted in subtle, measurable ways. Charter relationships became more transactional. Informal cooperation narrowed. Movement between regions slowed. Members traveled with increased caution. These changes did not signal weakness. They signaled recalibration. When violence cannot be clearly attributed or corrected, systems adapt by reducing exposure points rather than escalating force. Trust inside the structure tightened. Access became more controlled. Information sharing is narrowed to smaller circles. Individuals once considered reliable were reassessed quietly. This process does not require accusations. It operates through exclusion. Invitations stop coming. Roles are reassigned. Influence diminishes without explanation. This form of discipline avoids confrontation while still enforcing consequences. The killing also altered internal expectations around protection. Members understood that visibility no longer guaranteed a response. That realization changes behavior. Public presence decreased. Social spaces once considered neutral became liabilities. Members have limited time in mixed environments. These adjustments reduce risk, but increase isolation. Isolation reinforces control. Leadership dynamics shifted as well. Authority without clarity produces cautious leadership. Decisions are delayed. Consensus becomes harder to achieve. In such environments, maintaining stability takes priority over asserting dominance. Leaders focus on preventing further incidents rather than resolving past ones. This defensive posture preserves structure at the cost of momentum. The incident also affected recruitment and advancement. Fast-tracking slowed, vetting intensified. Prospects spent longer in transitional roles. The system corrected for the vulnerability exposed by accelerated promotion during instability. This correction was not acknowledged publicly. It was embedded into the process. Process absorbs lessons without admitting failure. Externally, rival groups observed the restraint. The lack of retaliation communicated caution rather than weakness. It signaled that escalation would not be met impulsively. In outlaw ecosystems, unpredictability deters conflict. Controlled restraint can function as deterrence when backed by reputation rather than action. Law enforcement misinterpreted this stability as stagnation. In reality, it was consolidation. Networks tightened. Communication became more disciplined. Exposure decreased. The organization emerged quieter, but not diminished. Quiet structures are harder to penetrate. Silence becomes operational rather than symbolic. Internally, the unresolved nature of the killing remained present. It was not discussed openly, but it influenced decisions. Members adjusted their behavior around individuals associated with the suspicion. Distance replaced confrontation. This avoidance prevented escalation, but preserved tension. Tension maintained vigilance. The system did not collapse because a collapse would have required acknowledgement. Acknowledgement invites accountability. Accountability invites exposure. Exposure threatens survival. By refusing to resolve the incident publicly or internally, the organization preserved its ability to function without admitting vulnerability. This strategy came with a cost. Loyalty became conditional. Advancement required deeper scrutiny. Trust became narrower. These are long-term consequences that do not appear in headlines but reshape organizations over time. The fracture held, the structure remained, the damage stayed contained, and the incident continued to exert pressure without ever being named. Reputation as a substitute for proof. Inside outlaw systems, proof is not the primary currency. Reputation is. When evidence cannot be produced or shared, reputations fill the vacuum. They shape decisions, alliances, and risk calculations without ever being confirmed. After the killing, this mechanism was activated immediately and never shut off. Reputation operates through accumulation. Prior violence, disciplinary history, personal volatility, and unresolved disputes combine into a working profile. That profile does not require validation. It requires consistency. When a violent act aligns with an existing profile, the belief solidifies, regardless of forensic outcome. This belief then governs behavior more effectively than formal findings ever could. The absence of an arrest did not weaken reputational narratives, it strengthened them. In this environment, evasion is interpreted as capability rather than innocence. The logic is internal and self-reinforcing. If someone could act and avoid consequences, their perceived threat increases. That perception influences how others interact with them long after the event. This dynamic reshaped internal distances. Members adjusted proximity based on belief, not confirmation. Associations were limited. Encounters became brief. Trust narrowed further. These changes did not require directives. They emerged organically from shared understanding. Reputation does not need enforcement. It enforces itself. Reputation also affects leadership calculations. Leaders do not need certainty to act cautiously. They need a risk assessment. When a figure carries a reputation for instability or violence, leaders hedge. They limit exposure. They avoid confrontation unless necessary. This restraint preserves stability, but allows unresolved threats to persist. Importantly, reputational judgment does not require unanimity. Partial belief is enough. When some members believe and others remain uncertain, behavior still shifts. Uncertainty encourages caution. Caution reduces interaction. Reduced interaction limits escalation. The system adapts without consensus. This process also distorts memory. Over time, reputational narratives replace factual uncertainty. Details blur, motives are assumed, timelines compress. The event becomes shorthand for a lesson rather than a case. That transformation makes reopening the matter increasingly difficult. Revisiting it threatens to disrupt settled assumptions. Reputation further complicates accountability. When belief substitutes for proof, no formal correction occurs. The suspected individual is neither cleared nor punished openly. They remain suspended. This suspension preserves ambiguity, which benefits the broader structure by avoiding conflict. It also ensures the tension never fully dissipates. For newer members, reputational narratives serve as warning systems. They learn which names carry weight and which spaces carry risk. This knowledge is transmitted quietly. No documentation, no explanation. Just an adjustment. The killing becomes instructional without being discussed. Law enforcement cannot penetrate this layer. Reputation is invisible externally. It leaves no records. It produces no statements. It operates through absence and avoidance. Investigators encounter a unified silence, while internal behavior shifts dramatically beneath the surface. Over time, reputation hardens into legacy. The individual associated with the suspicion becomes inseparable from the incident, regardless of factual truth. This legacy influences future interactions long after the original actors age out or disappear. It outlives evidence. It outlasts investigations. The system does not need resolution to function. It needs predictability. Reputation provides that predictability when proof cannot. The killing remained unresolved publicly, but internally, it settled into a permanent reference point that continued shaping behavior long after the asphalt was cleaned. The cost of public finality. Public killings inside outlaw ecosystems create a specific kind of damage. They remove the ability to manage outcomes quietly. A death in a controlled setting can be framed internally, corrected, or absorbed. A death on open asphalt forces visibility. Visibility invites scrutiny. Scrutiny disrupts operations long after the scene is cleared. The execution occurred where it could not be contained privately. Witnesses existed. Police responded immediately. Media attention followed. Even without arrests, the exposure altered operational behavior. Members reduced presence in mixed public environments. Social spaces once tolerated became liabilities. Visibility was no longer neutral. It carried risk. Public finality also removes ambiguity about consequences. Once someone is killed openly, there is no corrective path left. No demotion, no internal discipline, no negotiated resolution. Death becomes permanent messaging. That message travels farther than intended. It reaches individuals who were never involved, but now adjust their behavior out of caution. This type of violence disrupts hierarchy indirectly. Leadership must respond without responding. Any visible action risks escalation or exposure. Any inaction risks perceived weakness. The solution is strategic silence combined with operational tightening. This response preserves authority while avoiding confrontation, but it also limits flexibility. Public killings also affect revenue and logistics. Increased surveillance follows. Patrol patterns shift. Task forces monitor known locations. Financial flows are rerouted. These adaptations cost time and money. They are absorbed quietly, but they accumulate. The killing imposed a tax on the organization that extended far beyond the loss of one member. The inability to close the case compounded this cost. Unresolved public deaths remain active pressure points. They are revisited periodically by law enforcement and the media. Each revisit disrupts routine. Even without progress, the attention forces recalibration. Stability becomes maintenance rather than growth. Internally, public finality alters expectations of protection. Members understand that some deaths will not be avenged openly. This understanding changes how loyalty is perceived. Protection becomes conditional and situational rather than guaranteed. That shift discourages risk-taking and reinforces compliance, but it also erodes the sense of mutual security. Public finality also freezes narratives. Once an event becomes public record, internal reinterpretation becomes dangerous. Reframing risks. Contradiction. Contradiction invites questions. Questions invite exposure. The safest option is to let the public narrative exist without engagement. Silence becomes the only viable response. Over time, this dynamic creates institutional fatigue. The organization expends energy managing the consequences of visibility rather than pursuing objectives. Leaders focus on damage control. Members focus on avoidance. Expansion slows. Consolidation replaces ambition. The killing achieved finality for the victim, but prolonged consequences for the structure. Public deaths do not end stories inside outlaw systems, they embed them. Embedded stories constrain future action by shaping what is considered safe, permissible, or worth the risk. The asphalt was cleaned quickly. The operational cost was not. Leadership under constraint. Leadership inside outlaw motorcycle clubs depends on visibility, decisiveness, and consequence. After the killing, all three were constrained. Senior figures were already under legal pressure. Communication channels were restricted. Any overt response risked confirming patterns that law enforcement was actively mapping. Leadership was forced into a defensive posture that prioritized containment over assertion. This constraint altered how authority was exercised. Decisions became slower. Consensus was sought more carefully. Actions that might once have been handled through immediate correction were deferred or absorbed quietly. This was not hesitation born of uncertainty. It was a calculation. Acting without airtight internal alignment risked internal fracture and external exposure simultaneously. The structure of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club does not allow for unilateral action without consequence. Even powerful figures operate within expectations. When expectation becomes unclear, authority narrows. Leaders avoid creating new precedents when existing ones already attract attention. The killing created such attention. Legal constraints amplified this effect. Protective orders, surveillance, and informant pressure limited direct communication. Leadership relied on intermediaries who carried messages without attribution. This method preserves deniability, but dilutes clarity. Instructions become interpretations. Interpretations create variation. Variation increases risk. Leaders responded by limiting instruction rather than expanding it. This environment also reshaped internal discipline. Traditional enforcement mechanisms rely on clear chains of command. When those chains are stressed, enforcement shifts from action to access. Members who pose a risk are not confronted directly. They are marginalized. Their influence erodes quietly. This approach avoids confrontation while maintaining control, but it leaves underlying issues unresolved. Leadership under constraint also affects morale. Members sense hesitation even when it is strategic. Confidence in protection becomes conditional. That condition reinforces compliance but discourages initiative. The organization becomes more rigid and less adaptive. Stability is maintained, but growth is suppressed. The killing also complicated inter-charter dynamics. Leaders had to consider how responses would be interpreted beyond their immediate circle. Any action risked being read as escalation by rival groups or as confirmation of internal conflict. In a climate of heightened scrutiny, misinterpretation carried severe consequences. Law enforcement benefited indirectly from these constraints. Reduced activity, narrowed movement, and tightened communication created fewer openings, but also fewer mistakes. Investigators encountered a quieter organization that was harder to penetrate precisely because it was operating defensively. Over time, leadership adapted to this constrained state. Policies hardened, advancement slowed, visibility decreased. These adjustments stabilized operations but altered the culture. Risk tolerance dropped. Enforcement became less visible but more selective. The system learned to survive without resolution. The killing did not remove leadership. It limited how leadership could function. Authority remained intact, but its expression changed. Power shifted from action to restraint. Control was maintained, not through force, but through caution. This adaptation preserved the structure in the short term, It also ensured that the unresolved incident continued to shape decision-making long after the immediate danger passed. A case that would not die quietly.
As the Hells Angels were, they could perform tricks, do all kinds of crazy stunts that I couldn't do. And riding in a pack of Hells Angels, it takes an enormous amount of focus.
Unresolved killings do not disappear. They settle into institutional memory and resurface when conditions change. This case resisted closure not because evidence was absent, but because it remained useful. For law enforcement, it justified continued attention. For the organization, it reinforced discipline. Each side returned to it periodically, never resolving it, never abandoning it. Cold case status did not reduce pressure, it changed its form. Cold case status did not reduce pressure, it changed its form. Periodic reviews, reopened files, reassessed timelines, and recontacted peripheral figures. These actions disrupted routines without producing breakthroughs. Even without progress, the act of revisiting forced recalibration. Movement patterns adjusted, associations tightened, silence was reaffirmed. Public appeals extended the life of the case. Anniversaries triggered renewed attention. Media coverage resurfaced details that had faded from public memory. Each resurgence reminded members that the incident remained visible externally. That visibility discouraged complacency. It kept the lesson active. Public violence carries long-term consequences even when no arrests follow. Inside the organization, the case functioned as a reference point. It influenced decisions about exposure, location, and timing. Members learned which environments were liabilities. Leadership refined policies around visibility and advancement. The killing became embedded in operational logic without ever being discussed openly. The persistence of the case also complicated succession. New leaders inherited unresolved pressure. They were required to manage consequences they did not create. This inheritance narrowed their options. Any attempt to resolve the matter risked reopening scrutiny. Any attempt to ignore it risked miscalculation. Maintenance became the default strategy. Law enforcement understood this dynamic. Continued attention did not aim solely at resolution. It aimed at disruption. Even without arrests, the case justified surveillance, inquiries, and monitoring. These actions constrained operations and increased internal costs. The unresolved status became leverage. Time altered witness value. Memories degraded. Accounts conflicted. This decay benefited silence. Each year without progress reduced the likelihood of credible testimony. The passage of time transformed the case from solvable to symbolic. Symbols influence behavior even when facts are unreachable. The case also resisted internal mythologizing. It was not celebrated. It was not commemorated. It remained deliberately unspoken. This absence prevented romantic framing. It preserved the incident as a warning rather than a story. Warnings do not require detail, they require consequence. Attempts to close the case formally failed to gain traction. Without cooperation, prosecutors lacked a foundation. Without arrests, the file remained active but inert. This state satisfied no one, but destabilized everyone. It ensured continued vigilance on both sides. The asphalt where the killing occurred returned to normal quickly. The case did not. It lingered in databases, memories, and behavior patterns. Its persistence reshaped operations more effectively than resolution ever could have. A case that does not die quietly becomes infrastructure. It supports systems of control by reminding participants what happens when visibility, timing, and authority misalign. Discipline without documentation. Discipline inside outlaw organizations is rarely written and never archived. It operates through memory, repetition, and consequence. After the killing, no formal record existed of correction, authorization, or internal judgment. That absence was not a failure. It was the system working as designed. Documentation creates exposure. Exposure creates liability. Liability threatens survival. Without documentation, discipline relies on behavior change. Members adjust without being told why. Access shifts, roles narrow, invitations stop. These signals are subtle but unmistakable. They allow the organization to enforce standards without creating evidence of enforcement. Outsiders see inactivity, insiders recognize consequences. This method also protects leadership. If no directive exists, no directive can be traced. Responsibility dissolves into structure. Structure becomes the shield. Individuals act within understood boundaries rather than explicit instructions. This arrangement ensures that when outcomes occur, attribution remains impossible. The killing accelerated reliance on this undocumented discipline. Leadership avoided issuing guidance that could be misinterpreted or intercepted. Instead, expectations were reinforced indirectly. Behavior that increased risk was quietly discouraged. Behavior that preserved stability was rewarded with access and trust. These incentives reshaped conduct more effectively than punishment. Undocumented discipline also prevents escalation. Formal accusations require a response. Response invites conflict. Conflict draws attention. By avoiding formal processes, the system neutralizes threats without igniting them. This approach is slower but safer. It prioritizes endurance over resolution. Members internalized these signals quickly. Visibility decreased. Social interactions narrowed. Public-facing behavior became more cautious. These changes occurred without meetings or announcements. They spread through observation. Observation is the most reliable enforcement mechanism in closed systems. This form of discipline also preserves ambiguity around guilt. No one is officially cleared or condemned. This ambiguity prevents factionalization. When guilt is undefined, members cannot rally around opposing narratives. The organization avoids internal camps by refusing to acknowledge the question publicly. Law enforcement cannot penetrate undocumented discipline. There are no records to subpoena, no orders to intercept, no meetings to surveil. Investigators encounter a wall of uniform behavior without explanation. That uniformity frustrates inquiry and reinforces silence. The cost of this system is psychological. Members operate under constant interpretation. They must read signals accurately to avoid consequences. Mistakes are not corrected openly. They are punished quietly. This environment increases stress and reduces trust, but strengthens compliance. Over time, undocumented discipline becomes cultural. New members learn it without being taught. They observe outcomes and adjust accordingly. The killing became part of this curriculum, not as a story, but as a boundary, a reminder of what happens when alignment fails and exposure follows. The absence of documentation ensured that the incident could not be dissected or challenged internally. It remained intact as a lesson without details. Details invite debate. Debate invites fracture. Silence preserved unity. The system did not need to explain what happened. It only needed to ensure that behavior changed. That change endured long after the case faded from headlines, embedded in routines that left no trace for anyone outside the structure to find. The long shadow of an unanswered killing. Unanswered killings do not fade. They recede into the background and then reassert themselves when pressure shifts. Inside outlaw networks, unresolved violence becomes a permanent reference point. It informs decisions long after the people directly involved have moved on, aged out, or disappeared. The lack of closure does not weaken its influence, it extends it. The killing reshaped how risk was calculated. Members evaluated not only their actions, but also how those actions might be interpreted later under scrutiny. Ambiguity became dangerous. Clarity became survival. This recalibration narrowed acceptable behavior and reduced tolerance for deviation. The system did not loosen, it tightened. Interpersonal dynamics changed as well. Relationships once maintained through familiarity were reassessed through risk. Proximity carried consequence. Association implied alignment. These assumptions were not new, but the killing intensified them. Trust became conditional on predictability rather than loyalty alone. The long shadow also affected leadership succession. New figures inherited a structure conditioned by restraint. Aggressive assertion of authority became less viable. Leaders prioritized stability over expansion. Decisions were evaluated for exposure potential before effectiveness. This cautious leadership preserved order but limited flexibility. Law enforcement benefited indirectly from this environment. Reduced activity made patterns harder to detect, but also limited opportunities for infiltration. The organization became quieter, less visible, and more disciplined. Silence functioned as insulation rather than evasion. Public memory of the incident faded unevenly. Media attention resurfaced periodically, but never sustained momentum. Each resurgence reminded insiders that the case remained unresolved and therefore unpredictable. That unpredictability reinforced compliance without requiring enforcement. The killing also altered how disputes were managed. Open conflict carried increased risk. Quiet containment replaced confrontation. Issues that might once have escalated were suppressed or rerouted. This suppression preserved stability at the cost of unresolved tension. Over time, the incident became less about the individual and more about the lesson. It demonstrated what happens when authority is unclear, advancement is accelerated, and exposure is public. The lesson did not require explanation. It required repetition through behavior. The long shadow discouraged myth-making. The incident was not celebrated or integrated into identity. It remained deliberately absent from internal storytelling. Absence prevents reinterpretation. It preserves the event as a warning rather than a legend. Years later, the unanswered questions still constrained action. The lack of resolution ensured that no narrative could be closed. Open narratives invite revision. Closed narratives invite complacency. The organization chose neither. It left the story unfinished. That unfinished state maintained pressure without provoking collapse. It ensured vigilance without escalation. The killing did not end influence. It institutionalized caution. The shadow remains not because the truth is unknown, but because revealing it would destabilize more than it would resolve. Blood on the asphalt. The killing ultimately reduced the entire incident to a single image, a body on open pavement. That image mattered more than any internal explanation. Individed. It stripped away hierarchy, intent, and justification, and left only consequence. In outlaw systems, consequence is the only truth that cannot be argued. Blood on asphalt removes control from leadership. It transfers interpretation to witnesses, investigators, rivals, and lower-ranking members who must draw their own conclusions. Each group interprets the act differently, and none of those interpretations can be corrected without reopening the risk that caused the silence in the first place. Once violence becomes public, ownership is lost. The location ensured permanence. A private correction disappears into rumor. A public execution becomes a record. Police reports, media coverage, and public memory lock the event in place. Even when details blur, the fact remains: someone was killed openly, and no one was held accountable. That combination creates a durable signal of danger. Internally, the image of blood on pavement altered how discipline was understood. Internally, the image of blood on pavement altered how discipline was understood. Enforcement no longer appeared precise. It appeared absolute. The distinction between correction and elimination collapsed. That collapse discourages deviation more effectively than any formal rule. When the boundary is unclear, compliance increases. The killing also narrowed the margin for error permanently. Members understood that mistakes would not always be contained internally. Exposure became irreversible once crossed. This understanding reshaped behavior more deeply than policy ever could. Individuals began policing themselves with greater intensity, anticipating consequences that would never be explained. For leadership, the image imposed restraint. Any subsequent action risked being compared to the killing. Comparisons invite scrutiny. Scrutiny threatens stability. Leaders chose invisibility over assertion. That choice preserved structure but reduced adaptability. The organization survived, but it did not expand. Rival groups interpreted the image cautiously. The lack of retaliation signaled complexity rather than weakness. It suggested internal calculation and unresolved tension. That ambiguity discouraged direct challenges. Uncertainty is a deterrent when paired with reputation. Law enforcement interpreted the image as a failure and a leverage simultaneously. Failure because the case remained unsolved. Leverage because the unresolved status justified ongoing attention. The image sustained institutional interest even when evidence did not. It became a justification for surveillance without progress. Over time, the image replaced the individual. The name faded. The event remained. This transformation matters. It removes human sympathy and replaces it with operational memory. The incident stopped being about loss and became about exposure. Exposure is what organizations remember. The asphalt itself returned to normal. Traffic resumed. The bar continued operating. Nothing marked the spot. That erasure did not weaken the image, it strengthened it. The absence of a memorial reinforced the lesson that public deaths are not honored, they are absorbed and avoided. Inside the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, the incident never became doctrine. It became gravity. It pulled behavior inward without instruction. It shaped decisions without being referenced. It enforced discipline without documentation. Blood on the asphalt did not answer questions. It ended them. The killing did not haunt because it was unresolved. It haunted because it worked. Institutional memory as control. Long after individuals disappear, institutions remember. In outlaw organizations, memory is not preserved through records or storytelling. It is preserved through adjustment. The incident became embedded not as a narrative, but as a reference condition. Decisions before and after it were shaped by comparison to it, even when it was never mentioned. This is how institutions retain control without acknowledgement. Institutional memory operates by narrowing acceptable outcomes. Leaders and members evaluate choices against prior disruptions. Anything resembling the conditions that produced public exposure is avoided. This avoidance becomes policy without being written. Over time, it reshapes behavior more effectively than direct instruction. The killing functioned as a boundary marker that did not require reinforcement. New members absorbed this memory indirectly. They learned through restriction rather than explanation. Where could they go? Who they could be seen with? How quickly advancement occurred? These limits were not framed as consequences of a past incident. They were framed as a normal procedure. Normalization is how memory becomes invisible and permanent. Institutional memory also alters how risk is distributed. Responsibility shifts downward. Individuals are expected to anticipate danger without guidance. Failure to do so is treated as personal error rather than structural failure. This expectation reduces leadership exposure while increasing individual compliance. The system remains protected even when outcomes are severe. The killing reinforced the value of predictability over initiative. Members who acted within narrow, established patterns encountered fewer consequences. Those who attracted attention, even unintentionally, faced isolation. Over time, this dynamic discouraged deviation and rewarded conformity. Conformity stabilized operations but limited adaptability. Law enforcement pressure interacted with this memory in predictable ways. Each renewed inquiry reaffirmed the lesson that unresolved public violence remains a permanent liability. That reinforcement discouraged any attempt at retroactive clarification. Clarification invites scrutiny. Scrutiny threatens stability. Silence remained the safest response. Institutional memory also affected inter-charter relations. Communication became more formal and less frequent. Informal coordination was reduced. This reduction minimized the risk of misinterpretation and uncontrolled escalation. It also limited collective action. The organization chose insulation over expansion. The memory did not generate fear in the conventional sense. It generated caution. Fear can provoke a reaction. Caution produces restraint. Restraint preserves systems. The distinction matters. The incident did not damage the structure. It disciplined it. Over time, the original details lost relevance. What mattered was not who acted or why. What mattered was the outcome. Public exposure, no resolution, long-term consequence. These elements were sufficient to shape behavior indefinitely. Specifics became unnecessary. Institutional memory also ensured continuity across leadership changes. New leaders inherited the same constraints without being briefed on their origin. They operated within narrowed parameters because those parameters appeared natural. This inheritance preserved stability while obscuring cause. The killing did not need to be solved to exert control. Its unresolved status enhanced its utility. Resolution would have closed the loop and reduced its influence. Uncertainty kept it active. Active memory enforces discipline without force. Inside the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, the incident did not become history. It became an environment. An unseen pressure shapes movement, decision-making, and survival. Institutional memory replaced justice, and control endured without explanation.